August 1943. High above the shimmering expanse of the Central Pacific, the sky looks almost peaceful. At 18,000 feet, the air is thin and sharp. Sunlight glints off, scattered clouds drifting lazily below. Far to the west, a formation of Japanese aircraft circles near a convoy route, confident, controlled, untouched. For months, they have owned this sky. Then, a single shape appears on the horizon. One aircraft alone. Through binoculars, it barely registers at first. A distant silhouette, no escort, no formation, just a lone American fighter cutting through open airspace where it has no business being. Japanese officers, observing from below, exchange quiet amusement. Even among seasoned pilots above, there is no urgency, only curiosity. One plane is not a threat. One pilot is not a concern. But the aircraft does not turn away. It climbs steadily, deliberately, closing the distance with a precision that feels intentional. Inside the American cockpit, there is no hesitation, no wasted movement, just calculated silence, and somewhere between altitude and arrogance, the balance of control begins to shift. By the summer of 1943, the air war over the Pacific had entered a dangerous transition. In the early months following Pearl Harbor, Japanese air power had moved with startling efficiency. Their pilots were among the most experienced in the world, many trained through years of combat in China before the wider war ever began. Aircraft like the Mitsubishi A6M0 had quickly earned a reputation for unmatched maneuverability. Light, agile, and deadly in the hands of a skilled pilot, it dominated the early skies. Against this, American forces had initially struggled. U.S. fighter doctrine at the start of the war was still evolving. Many early encounters had been costly. Pilots flying aircraft, like the P-4 Warhawk, often found themselves outturned and outmatched in close-range dogfight. The instinct to engage head-on, to turn, chase, and outmaneuver played directly into Japanese strengths, and the Japanese noticed. Reports from the field reinforced a growing belief within Imperial Command. American pilots were aggressive but predictable, brave but tactically immature. Their machines were heavier, less responsive. Their formations, at least early on, were inconsistent. Confidence hardened into assumption. By mid-1942, this mindset had become embedded in operational thinking. Japanese squadrons often entered engagements expecting superiority not just in skill, but in control of the fight itself. A lone aircraft, especially, was considered insignificant. An isolated opponent suggested either poor coordination or a pilot already in trouble. But beneath the surface, something had begun to change. After the costly lessons of Coral Sea and Midway, American air forces started adapting rapidly. Training programs were revised. Combat reports were studied in detail. Pilots were no longer encouraged to fight on instinct alone, but to fight with discipline, patience, and structure. Aircraft design also began to shift the balance. Newer American fighters emphasized speed, durability, and firepower over tight turning ability. Instead of matching the Zero in its strengths, American engineers leaned into different advantages: diving speed, roll rate, and the ability to absorb damage and still return home. The philosophy was simple, but transformative. Do not fight the enemy's battle. Force them to fight yours. At the same time, coordination improved. American formations became tighter. Wingmen were trained to protect each other, not chase individual victories. Situational awareness replaced tunnel vision. Engagements became less chaotic and far more deliberate. Still, these changes were not immediately visible to the enemy. From a distance, American aircraft still appeared larger, heavier, less graceful in the air, and when seen alone, still vulnerable. Japanese pilots, many of them veterans with dozens of combat hours, relied heavily on visual assessment. If an aircraft didn't behave aggressively, if it didn't rush into a turning fight, it was often dismissed as hesitant, even inexperienced. This perception would prove dangerously outdated, because by 1943, American pilots were no longer reacting. They were setting traps, and the vast skies of the Pacific, with their long sidelines and open, maneuvering space became the perfect arena for a new kind of combat, one where speed replaced turning, where altitude became a weapon, and where patience could dismantle even the most confident formation. Some Japanese officers had begun to notice subtle changes. Engagements were lasting longer. Encounters with American fighters were becoming less predictable. Aircraft that should have been easy targets were suddenly elusive. But these observations had not yet reshaped doctrine. Old confidence still lingered, especially when the numbers seemed clear. A formation of experienced pilots against a single, isolated aircraft. In that equation, there was no uncertainty, only expectation. And that expectation formed in earlier victories, reinforced by habit, would soon be tested in a way few had anticipated, because what appeared in the sky that day was not a mistake. It was not a lost pilot, and it was not a sign of weakness. It was the visible edge of a tactical evolution, one that had been quietly building, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. And as that lone aircraft continued its steady climb, the assumptions of an entire air doctrine were about to be challenged. The transformation did not happen overnight. It was built from loss, from analyses, and from a willingness to abandon instinct in favor of discipline. By late 1942 and into 1943, American air combat doctrine began to crystallize into something fundamentally different from what had come before. The goal was no longer to outfight the enemy in the traditional sense. It was to outthink them systematically, repeatedly, and with as little risk as possible. One of the most important shifts came in how American pilots understood energy. Speed and altitude were no longer just conditions of flight. They became weapons. Instead of turning tightly with enemy aircraft leading speed and exposing themselves, pilots were trained to climb higher, stay faster, and strike only when conditions were favorable. This approach, often described as boom and zoom, relied on surprise and momentum. A pilot would dive from altitude, deliver a burst of concentrated fire, and then climb away before the enemy could respond effectively. It was not dramatic, it was not flashy, but it was brutally efficient. Aircraft, like the P-38 Lightning and the F-4U Corsair, were perfectly suited for this kind of combat. They could dive faster than most Japanese fighters and, more importantly, survive hits that would have crippled lighter aircraft. Their engines gave them the power to disengage, reset, and attack again on their own terms. This changed everything, because it removed the need to win a dogfight in the traditional sense. Now, a pilot didn't need to outturn the enemy. He only needed to control the engagement when it started, how long it lasted, and when it ended. Formation tactics evolved alongside this philosophy. American pilots began flying in tighter, more coordinated pairs and elements. The concept of mutual support became central. One pilot engaged, while the other observed, protected, and prepared to intervene. No one chased blindly. No one broke formation without purpose. This discipline made even small numbers effective. A single aircraft, if flown correctly, could manipulate the perception of a much larger threat. By controlling altitude and positioning, a lone pilot could appear suddenly, strike with precision, and disappear before the enemy fully understood what had happened. To an opponent expecting a traditional fight, this behavior felt unnatural. Japanese doctrine, shaped by years of success, still emphasized maneuverability and close-range engagements. Their pilots were trained to outturn, outposition, and outfight opponents in tight aerial duels. It was a system built around skill and instinct, one that had worked exceptionally well in the early years of the war. But it had a vulnerability. It assumed the enemy would play by the same rules. When American pilots refused to engage in turning fights, it created confusion. A target that did not commit could not be predicted. A pilot who disengaged was not defeated, just repositioning. And in that hesitation, control slipped. Some Japanese pilots began to adapt on an individual level. They recognized the danger of chasing diving aircraft. They noticed that American fighters often attacked from above, then vanished into the sun or cloud cover. But these observations remained fragmented. At the command level, the broader assumptions still held. American pilots lacked the finesse for close combat. Their reliance on speed and altitude was sometimes interpreted as avoidance and unwillingness to engage directly. In reality, it was the opposite. it was control. And perhaps most dangerously, it was quiet. There were no dramatic shifts visible from the ground, no sudden changes in aircraft appearance or formation size. The skies looked the same. The silhouettes were familiar, but the behavior had changed completely. Engagements became shorter, more decisive and less chaotic. Pilots who underestimated their opponent found themselves reacting instead of initiating. A moment of misjudgment, climb taken too late. A pursuit extended too far could be enough to reverse the entire engagement. And this is where perception became the most critical factor, because in aerial combat, what a pilot believes in the first few seconds often determines how the rest of the encounter unfolds. If an aircraft appears weak, it invites aggression. If it appears uncertain, it invites pursuit. And if it appears alone, it invites overconfidence. By 1943, American pilots understood this. They didn't just fight the enemy's aircraft, they fought the enemy's expectations. And on that clear August day, as a single American fighter climbed steadily toward a formation that believed itself unchallenged, those expectations were about to be used against them. In the cockpit of a fighter aircraft, the world compresses into fragments. Altitude, airspeed, horizon line, target positioning, fuel state. Each element competes for attention, yet must be processed simultaneously. For a lone pilot, the absence of a wingman removes an entire layer of awareness that would normally share the burden of observation. There is no second set of eyes scanning the blind spots, no external confirmation of threats forming outside the immediate field of view. Every decision must account for uncertainty. American pilots trained extensively for this reality. By 1943, doctrine emphasized mental clarity under pressure. A pilot separated from formation was not expected to panic or improvise recklessly. Instead, they were trained to revert to fundamentals, maintain altitude advantage, preserve energy, and assess before committing. This mindset created a controlled emotional state. Not the absence of fear, but the regulation of it. A lone pilot entering contested airspace understood that visibility cuts both ways. To the enemy, isolation may appear as vulnerability. But to the trained pilot, isolation also means freedom of movement. Without formation constraints, decisions can be made instantly without coordination delays. Every movement becomes intentional. Throttle adjustments are not reactive, but anticipatory. Turns are not defensive by default, but positioned for future advantage. Even apparent passivity such as climbing without engaging serve a larger tactical purpose. To outside observers, this can be misinterpreted. A steady climb may resemble hesitation. A lack of immediate aggression may appear as uncertainty, but internally, these actions reflect calculation rather than fear. In this sense, the lone pilot is not truly alone. They are operating within a framework of training, doctrine, and prior experience that guides each action with consistency. The evolution of American air combat tactics during this period centered on one core principle: do not surrender energy advantage. Energy, defined as a combination of speed and altitude, became the foundation upon which engagements were structured. A pilot with superior energy could dictate when to attack and when to disengage. A pilot without it was forced into reactive behavior. This led to a deliberate avoidance of prolonged turning engagements. Traditional dogfighting required sustained maneuvering at relatively low speeds, where aircraft would attempt to outturn one another in tight circles. While effective in certain conditions, this approach carried significant risks, particularly against opponents optimized for such maneuvers. Instead, American pilots adopted tactics that emphasized vertical movement and brief, high-speed. An attack would begin from a position of altitude advantage. The pilot would dive, increasing speed rapidly, delivering a concentrated burst of fire during a narrow window of opportunity. Once the pass was complete, the aircraft would climb back to altitude, restoring its energy state before considering another engagement. This cycle minimized exposure. It also reduced the likelihood of being drawn into unfavorable conditions. From the perspective of an opponent, this method could appear evasive. The attacking aircraft does not remain in close proximity. It does not engage in prolonged combat. Instead, it appears, strikes, and withdraws with efficiency. But this is not avoidance, it is control. Each phase of the maneuver is calculated to preserve advantage, while denying the enemy the opportunity to respond effectively. Even a single aircraft can execute this doctrine successfully, if conditions allow, by maintaining altitude superiority and choosing engagement timing carefully. It can influence the flow of battle, despite numerical inferiority. The effectiveness of this approach depends not on aggression, but on restraint. For many Axis pilots, early war experiences had reinforced a clear understanding of aerial combat dynamics. Success had often come through decisive maneuvering, close-range engagements, and the exploitation of superior agility. Aircraft designed for tight-turning radii and pilots trained for individual combat created a system that excelled when engagements unfolded in predictable patterns. However, this framework carried an implicit assumption that the opponent would engage under similar conditions. When American pilots began to adopt energy-based tactics, this assumption became less reliable. A lone aircraft approaching without immediate aggression could be interpreted as uncertain or inexperienced. The absence of a direct attack might suggest hesitation, inviting closer inspection or pursuit. This is where miscalculation occurs, because the interpretation of behavior is based on prior expectations rather than current reality. An aircraft that climbs instead of engaging may not be avoiding combat, it may be positioning for it. A pilot who maintains distance may not be retreating, it may be drawing the opponent into a disadvantageous position. In many engagements, the initial response to such behavior was pursuit, closing distance, forcing engagement, attempting to convert perceived vulnerability into a decisive advantage. However, pursuit requires commitment. Speed must be increased. Altitude is often traded for positioning. Focus and arrow is on the target ahead, reducing awareness of surrounding conditions. If the initial assessment is incorrect, this commitment can become a liability, because once an aircraft commits to a path, reversing that decision takes time, and in aerial combat, time is a critical constraint. The lone American pilot, operating under disciplined doctrine, could exploit this. By controlling altitude and timing, the pilot could influence when the opponent committed, ensuring that the engagement unfolded under conditions favorable to energy retention and positional advantage. Thus, what appears at first glance to be a simple imbalance, a single aircraft versus many, becomes more complex. It is not merely a numerical comparison, it is a difference in interpretation, and in combat, interpretation determines action. Aircraft technology in this phase of World War II played a decisive but often misunderstood role in shaping combat outcomes. American fighters were built around a balance of speed, structural strength, and engine power. These characteristics allowed pilots to execute high-speed dives, sustain energy during climbs, and absorb damage that would have otherwise forced an immediate disengagement. The ability to maintain control after taking hits gave pilots additional margin for error during engagements. In contrast, many Axis aircraft prioritized maneuverability. Lightweight construction and aerodynamic efficiency enabled tight turning performance, which was highly effective in close range. However, this design philosophy often came with trade-offs in durability and high-speed performance. This difference meant that engagement styles naturally diverged based on aircraft capabilities. American aircraft could leverage vertical space diving to gain speed, then climbing to regain altitude without losing structural integrity. This made boom-on-zoom tactics viable and repeatable. The aircraft's engine performance supported rapid acceleration, while its airframe allowed it to operate effectively under high-stress conditions. Japanese aircraft, while highly agile at lower speeds, were less suited to sustained high-speed engagements in prolonged dives or rapid energy exchanges. They could face limitations in acceleration, structural tolerance, and energy recovery. These technological differences did not determine victory on their own, but they shaped the boundaries within which pilots operated. When tactics aligned with the strengths of the aircraft, performance increased significantly. When misaligned, even skilled pilots could find themselves at a disadvantage. Leadership doctrine influenced not only how pilots trained, but how they executed decisions in real combat. American Air Forces emphasized standardized procedures, formation, discipline, and mutual support. Pilots were trained to operate as part of a coordinated system, where roles were defined and responsibilities shared. This reduced ambiguity during engagements and ensured that pilots could rely on consistent principles regardless of mission conditions. A key aspect of this doctrine was adaptability within structure. Pilots were not rigidly bound to a single pattern of behavior. Instead, they were given guidelines that allowed for real-time decision-making while still adhering to overarching tactical principles. This balance enabled both flexibility and cohesion. Formation tactics were central to this approach. Aircraft operated in pairs or small elements, allowing one pilot to engage while another maintained situational awareness. This reduced the likelihood of surprise attacks and improved the formation's ability to respond to dynamic threats. Leadership also emphasized survivability as a strategic asset. Preserving experienced pilots meant maintaining operational effectiveness over time. This influenced decisions in combat, encouraging pilots to disengage when necessary rather than pursue unnecessary risks. In contrast, leadership models that placed greater emphasis on individual initiative often produced highly capable pilots, but with greater variability in execution. The success of such systems depended heavily on individual skill and situational judgment. American doctrine reduced that dependency by embedding decision-making within a shared framework. This allowed even lone pilots, separated from formation, to act in a manner consistent with broader tactical expectations. Psychological shift. One of the most significant elements in aerial combat is the psychological response to unexpected situations. When an engagement begins, pilots rely on pattern recognition to guide their actions. Previous experience informs expectations about how an opponent will behave. These expectations allow for rapid decision-making under pressure. However, when those patterns are disrupted, uncertainty enters the equation. In the case of a lone aircraft approaching without immediate aggression, initial assumptions may lead to underestimation. But as the engagement unfolds and the aircraft demonstrates controlled, calculated maneuvering, those assumptions begin to weaken. This creates a psychological shift. Pilots who anticipated a straightforward engagement must now reassess. Each maneuver by the opposing aircraft introduces new information that may contradict earlier expectations. This requires constant adjustment in real time. Hesitation can result from this process, not necessarily due to fear, but due to the need to reconcile observed behavior with expected outcomes. In fast-paced aerial combat, even brief moments of uncertainty can influence timing, coordination, and response. As confidence decreases, pilots may become more cautious in their actions. Pursuit may slow. Engagement decisions may be delayed. Formation integrity may take precedence over aggressive maneuvers. This shift does not imply loss of capability, but rather adaptation to an evolving situation. In engagements where one side successfully imposes uncertainty on the other, control of the encounter can gradually transition, not through overwhelming force alone, but through the ability to disrupt expectations and force continuous reaction. In this way, psychology becomes an integral component of tactics, because what a pilot believes about the situation often determines how they act, and how they act determines how the engagement unfolds. The sky is a vast, unforgiving arena, and today, it's the stage for a true David versus Goliath showdown. Down below, the world is a blur of green and brown. Up here, it's a deadly chessboard. A lone American F-16 Falcon, Calcine Viper, finds itself staring down the impossible. A tight formation of 4 enemy fighters, flying in perfect, menacing unison. They think they have him boxed in, a lone wolf surrounded by the pack. They're about to learn a very hard lesson. The enemy leader breaks formation, streaking towards Viper, Missilok screaming in his ears. But this pilot is no rookie. Instead of panicking, he pulls back hard on the stick, a gut-wrenching 9G climb that pushes him to the edge of consciousness. He rockets straight up, defying gravity, letting the enemy fighter overshoot right beneath him. It's a classic high-G yo-yo, executed with sheer perfection. Now, the hunter has become the hunter. Before the enemy pilot can even realize his mistake, Viper is on his 6th. A quick burst from the Vulcan cannon, and the first bandit is a puff of smoke against the blue canvas. 1 down, 3 to go. The remaining enemies scatter, their perfect formation shattered. They try to swarm him, coming from multiple angles, a web of contrails tightening around him. But Viper is a phantom, a blur of motion. He dives, he rolls, he jinks, his F-16 dancing through their attacks like a leaf on the wind. He uses the terrain, dropping low into a canyon, the rock walls a hair's breadth from his wing. The enemy fighters, less agile and less daring, are forced to pull up. It's the opening he needs. He pops up behind them, a ghost from the canyons. A Fox 2 missile screams off the rail, finding its mark. Another enemy plane blossoms into a fireball. 2 down. The remaining pair, their confidence shaken, decide they've had enough. They turn tail and run, pushing their engines to the limit. But there's no escaping the Viper. With calculated patience, he lines up the shot on the trailing aircraft. One more missile. One more perfect hit. 3 down. The final pilot, alone and terrified, can only watch his wingmen disintegrate. He doesn't even try to fight back. He just runs for the horizon. Our pilot lets him go. The message has been sent. Today, this patch of sky belonged to one pilot, one machine, and an incredible display of skill and courage. That's the kind of split-second decision-making that separates the aces from the rest. What an incredible performance! If you love stories of Ariel, skill, and bravery, make sure to hit that subscribe button for more. Thanks for watching. In the immediate moments following the engagement, the airspace settles into a cautious stillness. The Japanese formation, once cohesive and confident, now operates with visible restraint. Aircraft that had previously maintained looser spacing tighten their positions. Movements become more deliberate, with pilots prioritizing awareness over aggression. The damaged aircraft has already fallen out of the main engagement zone, while others reposition to regroup and reassess. There is no pursuit. The lone American fighter, having completed its attack sequence, does not press further. It remains at altitude or in controlled motion, maintaining energy rather than committing to unnecessary risk. This decision reinforces the underlying tactical approach: engage, strike decisively, and disengage before the opponent can effectively respond. Radio communications, where available, shift from fragmented urgency to structured coordination. Short transmissions replace overlapping calls. Pilots confirm positions, report status, and begin restoring formation integrity. The tone reflects a transition from engagement to recovery. From a broader perspective, the immediate outcome is not simply measured in aircraft damaged or lost, but in the alteration of behavior during the encounter itself. The formation that entered the engagement with confidence leaves it with increased caution. That change, though subtle, is operationally significant. In the hours and days that follow, reports of the encounter are compiled and analyzed. Observers and commanders review available details, altitude profiles, maneuver sequences, engagement timing. The key point that emerges is not just that a single aircraft engaged multiple opponents, but that it did so while controlling the terms of the encounter. This leads to a gradual reassessment at the tactical level. Patterns begin to be recognized across multiple engagements in different areas of the theater. American aircraft are increasingly observed using altitude advantage, controlled dives, and rapid disengagements. These behaviors are consistent rather than isolated, suggesting a doctrinal approach rather than an incidental occurrence. For Japanese forces, this introduces a need to adapt procedures. Pilots are encouraged to exercise greater caution when pursuing diving aircraft, and to maintain better situational awareness of altitude threats. Formation discipline becomes even more critical, as fragmentation during engagement proves to be a vulnerability. However, doctrinal change is not immediate. Experienced pilots continue to rely on established combat methods that have proven effective in earlier phases of the war. The transition occurs unevenly, influenced by unit experience, leadership interpretation, and operational pressure. On the American side, the engagement reinforces existing training principles. Reports from returning pilots align with expectations. Maintain energy advantage, avoid unnecessary turning engagements, and exploit positioning to dictate the flow of combat. The success of a lone aircraft operating within this framework demonstrates that even in isolation, adherence to doctrine can yield favorable outcomes. Strategically, the broader impact lies in perception. Encounters like this contribute to a gradual shift in how both sides view air combat. Numerical superiority alone is no longer assumed to guarantee control. Tactical execution, energy management, and timing become increasingly important factors. Over time, this influences planning, training, and engagement behavior across the theater. Aircraft technology continues to evolve, but equally important is the evolution of how that technology is used. The engagement stands as a representative example of this transition where control of the fight is not determined at the moment of contact alone, but through preparation, discipline, and the ability to adapt under pressure. In that sense, the immediate consequences of the encounter extend far beyond a single engagement, contributing to a broader shift in aerial warfare dynamics that continues to unfold throughout the conflict. Moments like this are rarely remembered for their scale. No vast fleets, no sweeping bombardments. Just a brief encounter in the open sky. It was measured in minutes, defined by positioning, and resolved through discipline. But within that exchange lies a deeper truth about modern warfare. Victory isn't always about numbers or initial confidence. It's shaped by adaptation, the ability to recognize change, question assumptions, and adjust doctrine faster than an opponent. The lone pilot wasn't just fighting aircraft, he was operating within a system refined by experience and loss. Every maneuver reflected training, every decision a philosophy of control over chaos. On the other side, confidence can blind you. When reality doesn't match expectations, hesitation follows. And in aerial combat, small moments of uncertainty have lasting consequences. This engagement reminds us that combat is a contest of awareness, seeing clearly and acting decisively. Thanks for watching, and be sure to subscribe for more.